You wake up one morning, and before you even fully open your eyes, a heavy, quiet panic settles into your chest. It is a subtle, haunting sensation that you are somehow late. You look at your age, you look at your bank account, you look at the trajectory of your peers, and you feel a profound, sinking conviction that everyone else was handed a map to a destination you are still trying to find. You feel completely, undeniably behind in life. For most of us, this feeling starts as a whisper in our 20s and grows into a roar in our 30s and 40s. You start believing that you have missed the train, that your potential has expired, or that you are inherently flawed because your life does not look like the timeline you were promised. But what if this sensation is not an objective reflection of your reality? What if the feeling of being behind is actually a deeply ingrained psychological habit, a specific way of processing the world that you have unknowingly practiced for years? Personality changes rarely happen overnight in dramatic cinematic moments. They happen so gradually that people almost never notice them taking place. They begin as ordinary behaviors, which turn into daily repetitions, which create subtle psychological effects, which slowly calcify into the traits we eventually call our personality. The question we have to ask is not simply why you feel behind, but rather, what if some parts of your personality are not simply who you are, but what you have practiced for a very long time? Think of the mind like a path through a forest. Walking through the forest once doesn't create much of a path. But walk in the same direction every day and the grass slowly bends. The soil compacts. Eventually, the path becomes easier to follow than the wild grass around it. The brain can work in a similar way. What we repeatedly practice can become easier to repeat. Repeated behaviors and thought patterns can deeply influence our attention, our emotional responses, our expectations, our habits, our self-perception, our coping patterns, and our automatic reactions. This does not mean that your personality is completely determined by your habits or that your struggles are entirely your fault. Personality is incredibly complex, shaped by genetics, trauma, and environment. The goal here is not to suggest a deterministic transformation, but to explain how gradual influence works. Because once you understand how your brain learns to feel behind, you can begin to teach it something else. You open your phone on a random Tuesday afternoon. Within 3 minutes, you see an engagement announcement, a post about a new promotion, and a photo of a friend buying their first house. You suddenly feel a visceral drop in your stomach. It isn't jealousy, it is panic. You immediately close the app. But the ghost of that anxiety follows you into your kitchen, into your work, and into your bed. And strangely, the hardest part isn't seeing their success. It's the immediate, brutal assessment of your own life that follows. Maybe you call yourself a failure. Maybe you think you're simply not ambitious enough, or that you have wasted the best years of your life. Maybe you've started believing that being a perpetual underachiever is just your personality. But this is not because you are fundamentally broken. This is where the psychology of upward social comparison and the social clock becomes interesting. Human beings are biologically wired to belong to a tribe, and we gauge our safety in that tribe by observing collective norms. The social clock is the internalized cultural timeline of when certain milestones like marriage, career stability, or homeownership should happen. When you perceive yourself as deviating from that timeline, your brain does not just register it as a difference in preference, it registers it as a social danger. Comparing yourself to others can create an immediate sharp spike of anxiety, and that anxiety can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate other people's milestones with your own lack of safety. The problem is that what makes you feel vigilant today can make the entire world feel like a threat tomorrow. You might see this pattern bleed into ordinary life. You might rush into a relationship you don't even really want or take a job that makes you miserable simply to check an invisible box and soothe the panic. It is like running a race on a treadmill next to someone riding a bicycle. You are exhausted, staring at their speed, completely ignoring the fact that you are operating entirely different vehicles. You are measuring the pace, but ignoring the context. If you repeatedly measure your life against an invisible cultural clock, you may gradually become more comfortable with chronic anxiety than internal peace. If you repeatedly use other people's highlights as a weapon against your own reality, external validation may begin to feel more important than personal fulfillment. If you repeatedly practice feeling inadequate, inadequacy itself may begin to feel less like a passing emotion and more like your core identity. The habit isn't necessarily bad in its origin. In fact, it probably started for a reason. It may have originally motivated you. It may have kept you socially attuned. The problem begins when the strategy that once motivated you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today? And what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you are not a failure who is running out of time. Maybe you've simply practiced measuring your highly specific, beautifully complex life with a generic manufactured ruler. What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced evaluating your life based on your own values for the next year, what might become easier? The important question isn't whether this habit makes you a good or bad person. The question is simpler. What is this habit teaching you to become comfortable with? You look back at the last year of your life, or perhaps the last 5 years, and you think, I have absolutely nothing to show for it. You sit down and try to calculate your progress, but because there is no new job title, no graduation certificate, and no dramatic financial leap, you conclude that you have been entirely stagnant. And strangely, the hardest part isn't the lack of a trophy. It's the heavy, hollow feeling that you are dissolving into thin air. Maybe you call yourself lazy. Maybe you think you're simply adrift, lacking the discipline to make anything happen. Maybe you've started believing that this lack of momentum is just who you are. But this is not because you are incapable of growth. This is where the psychology of negativity bias and outcome-based self-evaluation comes into play. The human brain is incredibly practical. It loves tangible, quantifiable metrics because they are easy to categorize and track. But deep emotional and psychological maturation is entirely invisible. Discounting your invisible growth can create an immediate, albeit painful, sense of certainty. You tell yourself you are failing, and that certainty can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate self-worth strictly with visible production. The problem is that what gives you a clear metric for evaluation today can make your own internal evolution feel entirely worthless tomorrow. You might have spent the last 2 years learning how to set healthy boundaries, or healing from a devastating heartbreak, or finally learning how to sit alone in a room without hating yourself. But because those triumphs cannot be placed on a resume, you completely dismiss them. It is like looking at a massive oak tree in the dead of winter. Above ground, its branches are bare, and it looks completely dead. But below ground, its root system is expanding, fortifying itself to survive the coming storms. If you only judge the tree by its leaves, you miss the profound survival happening in the dark. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change how we measure success. They change what we naturally consider valuable. If you repeatedly discount your unquantifiable growth, you may gradually become more comfortable with performative achievement than genuine healing. If you repeatedly ignore your emotional survival, self-compassion may begin to feel less like a right and more like a delusion. If you repeatedly practice treating yourself like a machine, being treated like a machine may begin to feel less threatening than being treated like a human. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have protected you from complacency. It may have pushed you to survive in a hyper-competitive world. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today? And what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you are not stagnant. Maybe you have simply practiced ignoring the deep, invisible work required to sustain the next chapter of your life. What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced honoring your unseen survival for the next year, what might become easier? The important question isn't whether this habit makes you a good or bad person. The question is simpler. What is this habit teaching you to become comfortable with? Notice what is happening here. None of these behaviors look powerful. They look like passing thoughts. That's precisely why they are powerful. The things that shape us are not always dramatic. Sometimes they are the things we repeat so often that we stop noticing them entirely. You receive an invitation to a dinner party or a high school reunion. You look at the message and immediately, your mind flashes to the inevitable question, so what are you doing with your life these days? Your chest tightens. You craft a polite excuse, decline the invitation, and stay home. And strangely, the hardest part isn't missing the event. It's the relief you feel when you decide to hide. Maybe you call yourself an introvert. Maybe you think you're simply protecting your peace. Maybe you've started believing that being isolated is just your personality. But this is not because you are naturally antisocial. This is where the psychology of shame-induced withdrawal becomes incredibly relevant. Shame is not just the feeling that you did something wrong. It is the profound conviction that you are fundamentally flawed. When you feel behind in life, facing peers feels like stepping into a spotlight of your own inadequacy. Avoiding social interactions can create immediate emotional relief, and that relief can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate isolation with safety. The problem is that what gives you relief from judgment today can make human connection feel even harder tomorrow. You might notice yourself taking longer to reply to texts from friends who are thriving. You might gradually shrink your social circle to only include people who won't trigger your sense of inadequacy. It is like a ship staying in the harbor to avoid the turbulent waves of the ocean. At first, the harbor is simply convenient and safe. But after months of staying docked, barnacles begin to rot the hull. The ship forgets how to sail. The harbor has become a prison. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change where we go, they change where we naturally consider ourselves allowed to exist. If you repeatedly isolate yourself out of shame, you may gradually become more comfortable with loneliness than vulnerability. If you repeatedly hide your reality, genuine connection may begin to feel less tolerable than maintaining a facade. If you repeatedly practice shrinking your world to avoid judgment, being unseen may begin to feel less threatening than being known. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have protected you from cruel comparisons. It may have given you space to grieve. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today? And what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you are not protecting your peace. Maybe you've simply practiced hiding your reality from others because you haven't yet accepted it yourself. What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced allowing yourself to be seen exactly as you are for the next year, what might become easier? The important question isn't whether this habit makes you a good or bad person. The question is simpler. What is this habit teaching you to become comfortable with? By this point, you might be noticing something uncomfortable. Most of these behaviors, the comparing, the discounting, the hiding, don't feel like decisions anymore. They feel like you. That's the strange thing about repetition. At first, you choose the behavior. Eventually, the behavior can begin choosing for you. But a habit can influence your personality without defining your identity. Recognizing a pattern is not a reason to shame yourself. It is a reason to become more conscious of it. You decide it is finally time to make a change. You want to learn a new language, pivot to a new career, or start a creative project. But the moment you sit down to begin, a voice whispers, "You're already 5 years late." If you're going to do this, it has to be perfect right now just to catch up. So you spend 3 weeks researching the absolute best way to begin, waiting for the perfect moment, and you never take step one. Maybe you call yourself a perfectionist. Maybe you think you're simply analytical and hold yourself to high standards. Maybe you've started believing that this intense hesitation is just your personality. But this is not because you are dedicated to excellence. This is where the psychology of all or nothing thinking and ego defense becomes crucial. When you already feel behind, the idea of being a beginner is uniquely humiliating. Your ego is fragile, and the prospect of making a mistake feels like confirmation of your failure. Demanding immediate perfection can create an immediate, socially acceptable excuse not to try. And that excuse can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate over-optimization with safety from failure. The problem is that what protects your ego today can make the actual act of starting feel even more impossible tomorrow. You might read 10 books on how to write a novel without writing a single paragraph. You might spend a month building the perfect workout schedule, but never step foot in a gym. It is like refusing to walk up a flight of stairs because you haven't figured out how to teleport directly to the top floor. At first, you think you are just being efficient, but eventually, you stop even considering the stairs. The refusal to climb doesn't keep you safe. It keeps you stuck in the lobby. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change how we prepare. They change our fundamental willingness to be vulnerable. If you repeatedly demand perfection before beginning, you may gradually become more comfortable with theoretical planning than messy reality. If you repeatedly refuse to be a beginner, learning may begin to feel less like a joy and more like a humiliation. If you repeatedly practice avoiding the friction of starting itself may begin to feel less possible. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have protected you from looking foolish. It may have helped you avoid careless mistakes in the past. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today, and what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you don't actually have impossibly high standards. Maybe you've trained yourself to use perfectionism as a beautiful, respectable excuse to avoid the vulnerability of being a beginner again. What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced allowing yourself to be delightfully bad at something for the next year, what might become easier? The important question isn't whether this habit makes you a good or bad person. The question is simpler. What is this habit teaching you to become comfortable with? You go about your week, checking off tasks, paying bills, and keeping yourself alive. But there is a strange, persistent background noise to your existence. You catch yourself thinking, once I get that job, my life will really begin. Or, once I find a partner, I will finally be a real adult. You treat your current life as a waiting room, a mere prologue to the actual story that hasn't started yet. And strangely, the hardest part isn't the waiting. It's the terrifying suspicion that you are missing the main event. Maybe you call yourself goal-oriented. Maybe you think you're simply ambitious, hungry for a better life. Maybe you've started believing that this chronic dissatisfaction is just the engine of your personality. But this is not because you are inherently driven. This is where narrative identity and the psychological focus on the gap become profound. Narrative identity is the internalized story you create about yourself to make sense of your life. When you feel behind, you begin to anchor your core identity not to what you have or who you are, but to what you lack. Existing solely in the gap between where you are and where you think you should be can create an immediate sense of purpose. And that purpose can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate your deficits with your identity. The problem is that what drives you forward today can make arriving at any destination feel entirely empty tomorrow. You might finally achieve a goal you worked years for, and instead of feeling joy, you feel a brief moment of relief before immediately locking your eyes onto the next thing you lack. You never actually let yourself arrive. Imagine writing a sentence on a piece of paper once. It doesn't change much. Write the same sentence every day for years, however, and eventually, you may stop reading it as a sentence. You may start reading it as a description of yourself. I am behind. I am not yet enough. The repetition has become automatic. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change what we focus on. They change how we define our own existence. If you repeatedly anchor your identity to what you lack, you may gradually become more comfortable with dissatisfaction than gratitude. If you repeatedly view the present moment as a waiting room, experiencing joy in the present tense may begin to feel less like a right and more like a distraction. If you repeatedly practice defining yourself by the gap itself may begin to feel like your only home. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have driven you to survive incredible hardships. It may have fueled your ambition when you had nothing else. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today? And what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you are not just ambitious. Maybe you have practiced defining your worth by your deficits for so long that you don't know who you are without a crisis of inadequacy to solve. What if some of the things you call your personality are simply patterns that have been repeated long enough to feel permanent? What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced believing that your life has already started for the next year, what might become easier? The important question isn't whether this habit makes you a good or bad person. The question is simpler. What is this habit teaching you to become comfortable with? But there is a deeper idea underneath all of this. We have been culturally conditioned to view life as a strictly linear track. You go to school, you get a job, you find a partner, you buy a house, you retire. If you step off that track, the world tells you that you are falling behind. But life is not a linear track. It is a topography. It has mountains and valleys and deep forests and sprawling deserts. You are not behind everyone else because you are not walking the same terrain. Understanding this difference between who you are and what you repeatedly practice is the key to untangling your identity from your anxiety. Changing a pattern does not mean you have to completely destroy yourself to become a different person. It simply means giving yourself more choices. A steering wheel doesn't decide where a car must go. It simply gives the driver the ability to change direction when the road curves. Awareness works in a similar way. Realizing that you have been practicing the habit of feeling behind does not instantly teleport you to a place of perfect peace, but it gives you agency. It gives you the steering wheel back. One day doesn't define you. One moment of social comparison doesn't define you. One missed milestone doesn't define you. One bad habit doesn't define you. But what you repeatedly return to deserves your attention. The small, quiet ways you speak to yourself when you see someone else succeeding, the subtle ways you hide your struggles from your friends, the invisible ways you discount your own survival. These are not insignificant simply because they are small. They are repeated, and repetition accumulates into a life. What are you practicing becoming? When you look at the gap between where you are and where you thought you would be, are you practicing shame or are you practicing grace? You are allowed to be exactly where you are. You are allowed to be a beginner at an age when everyone else seems to be an expert. You are allowed to redefine the timeline, because perhaps the person you become isn't decided in one dramatic, flawless moment of finally catching up. Perhaps they are being shaped quietly, gently, and inevitably in the things you do again tomorrow.